Chapter 3. The Forsaken Cabin. The path leading deeper into Blackwood Forest was overgrown and treacherous. The dense canopy above casting long shadows over the group as they ventured further into the unknown. Zephyr led the way, his every step measured, his eyes scanning the surroundings with the wariness of someone who knew they were being watched. Behind him, the others followed in tense silence, the weight of their recent discoveries hanging over them like a shroud. It had been a restless night, filled with unsettling dreams and the creeping realization that the town's coast was far from over. Despite their exhaustion, the group had agreed to return to the forest, determined to uncover the truth behind the lingering darkness that still haunted the town. As they trudged forward, Callie's usual wit was subdued, replaced by unnervous energy that she tried to mask with forced humor. "So, who's betting we'll find something that will make us regret coming back here? Anyone? No? Just me?" Orion, ever the logical one, glanced at her. "Given our track record, it's a safe bet. But we need to do this. Whatever's causing the disturbances in town might have roots here in the forest. Roots we're about to dig up," Thad muttered, his tone edged with his characteristic skepticism. He wasn't one to believe in the supernatural, but recent events had shaken even his firm stance on reality. The forest grew thicker, the path narrowing until they were practically brushing against the gnarled, twisted trees. The air felt colder, the shadows darker, as if the forest itself was reacting to their presence. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, the only sounds the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig. Then, without warning, the trees opened up to reveal a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its weathered wood dark with age. The windows cracked and clouded with grime. The roof sagged in places, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking on its rusted hinges as the wind blew through the clearing. The sight of the cabin sent a chill down each of their spines, a feeling of foreboding settling over them. "This must be it," Zephyr said, his voice low. "The source of the strange energy we felt in the forest." Sarah, standing beside him, shivered as she looked at the cabin. "It feels wrong, like it doesn't belong here."
Orion stepped forward, his eyes narrowed as he studied the symbols carved into the wooden beams, framing the door. "These markings, they're the same as the ones we saw in the forest. This cabin is connected to the curse. There might be something inside that can tell us more, or something that's better left alone," Thad countered, though he didn't make a move to stop them. Despite his doubts, he knew they couldn't turn back now. Zephyr approached the cabin cautiously. It groaned in protest, the sound echoing through the clearing like a warning. Inside, the cabin was dark, the faint light from outside barely penetrating the gloom. Dust motes danced in the air, and the smell of decay was strong, as if the cabin had been abandoned for centuries. As they stepped inside, the floorboards creaked ominously underfoot. The interior was sparse: an old table and chair, a crumbling fireplace, and shelves lined with strange, unidentifiable objects. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the air was thick with the weight of the past. Orion immediately gravitated toward the symbols etched into the walls, tracing them with his fingers as he muttered to himself, "These are protective wards, or they were meant to be. They've lost their power over time, but whoever lived here was trying to keep something out, or maybe in." Sarah wandered to the shelves, her eyes scanning the objects that lined them. There were old books, their covers cracked and faded, and jars filled with unrecognizable substances. One jar in particular caught her eye, its contents a swirling, dark mist that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. "What is this?" she whispered, reaching out to touch the jar. But before she could, Isolde's hand shot out to stop her. "Don't," Isolde warned, her voice sharp. "That's not something you want to mess with. It's dangerous." Sarah pulled her hand back, unnerved by Isolde's reaction. "How do you know?" Isolde hesitated, her eyes flickering with something unreadable before she quickly masked it. "Just a feeling. This place, it's filled with dark magic. We need to be careful." Zephyr, meanwhile, had moved to the center of the room, where a large, ornate box rested on the floor. It was covered in the same symbols, and it seemed to hum with a low, vibrating energy. "This must be what's anchoring the curse," he said, kneeling down to examine it. "We need to figure out how to open it." Orion joined him, his eyes lighting up with curiosity. It's another puzzle. The symbols on the box match the ones on the walls, but they're in a different order. If we can decipher the pattern, we might be able to unlock it. As Orion and Zephyr began working on the puzzle, Kali and Thad stood by the door, keeping watch. Kali's eyes darted around the cabin, her nerves on edge. I don't like this, she muttered. It feels like something's about to go wrong. Thad nodded in agreement, his usually cool demeanor strained. Just keep an eye out. If anything happens, we need to be ready to move. Minutes passed in tense silence as Orion and Zephyr carefully manipulated the symbols on the box. The air in the cabin grew thicker, the sense of dread more pronounced. Every creak and groan of the old wood seemed louder, more menacing, as if the cabin itself was alive and aware of their presence. Finally, with a soft click, the box unlocked. Zephyr and Orion exchanged a quick glance before slowly lifting the lid. Inside, they found a small, intricately carved amulet resting on a bed of black velvet. The amulet was shaped like a twisted, knotted tree, its branches extending outward in an intricate pattern. It radiated a cold, dark energy, and the moment the lid was fully open, the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop several degrees. "This is it," Orion said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This amulet, it's the source of the curse, or at least a part of it." Before anyone could react, the cabin suddenly shuddered, the walls creaking and groaning as if under immense pressure. The symbols on the walls began to glow with a faint, eerie light, and the dark mist in the jar Syrah had noticed earlier began to swirl more violently, the energy in the room reaching a fever pitch. "We need to get out of here," Zephyr shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Now, the group scrambled toward the door, but just as they reached it, the cabin's floor buckled, and a deafening crack echoed through the room. The amulet's energy surged, filling the space with a dark, oppressive force that threatened to crush them. Isolde, her face pale and eyes wide with fear, grabbed Syrah's arm and pulled her toward the exit. "Come on, we have to move." They burst out of the cabin just as the roof caved in, the entire structure collapsing in on itself with a thunderous crash. The group stumbled into the clearing, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests as they watched the cabin disintegrate into a pile of rubble. For a moment, all was silent. Then, from the wreckage, a dark figure began to rise, its form shifting and indistinct, like smoke given shape. The figure hovered above the ruins, its presence exuding a malevolent energy that chilled them to the bone. What is that?" Kali stammered, her voice trembling with fear. Zephyr stepped forward, his jaw set in grim determination. "It's the curse, or at least, what's left of it. We've disturbed it by taking the amulet." The figure slowly turned to face them, its featureless face somehow conveying a deep, ancient anger. It seemed to be studying them, its form rippling as it gathered its strength. "We need to destroy the amulet," Orion said urgently, his mind racing. "It's the only way to stop this thing." But before they could act, the figure surged toward them, its shape expanding and growing more defined. The group barely had time to react before the shadowy entity was upon them, its tendrils reaching out, intent on enveloping them in its darkness. "Run!" Zephyr shouted, his voice cutting through the terror that gripped them. They turned and fled into the forest, the dark figure close behind, its presence like a storm gathering on the horizon. The trees seemed to close in around them as they ran, the path ahead barely visible through the thickening shadows. But they couldn't stop, not now, not when they were so close to the truth. The curse had taken on a life of its own, and it was up to them to end it before it consumed them all. The forest seemed to blur past them as they raced through the underbrush, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The dark figure pursued them relentlessly, its presence an ever-looming threat, distorting the air with a chilling aura. The shadows between the trees grew deeper, more menacing, as if the forest itself was complicit in the malevolent force's quest to capture them. Zephyr led the way, his mind racing to find a solution. "We need to find a place to regroup," he shouted over his shoulder. Somewhere we can catch our breath and figure out our next move. Agreed, Orion replied, struggling to keep pace. But we have to make sure we're not leading it directly to the town. They barreled through the forest, branches clawing at their clothes and faces, their path illuminated only by the occasional glimpse of the sky through the dense canopy. Kali, usually quick with a quip, was now silent, her face pale with fear. Syrah clung to Thad, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. After what felt like an eternity, they stumbled into a small, secluded clearing. Zephyr signaled for them to halt, and they collapsed onto the ground, trying to catch their breath. The oppressive silence of the forest was almost as eerie as the dark figure that had chased them. The clearing was eerily quiet, save for the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a forest bird. We need to find out more about that amulet, Zephyr panted, still scanning their surroundings for any sign of the entity. There has to be something in the cabin's wreckage or in town that can tell us how to destroy it properly. Orion nodded, his face set in concentration. We need to return to the town. There might be records or historical accounts that can help us understand the amulet's significance and how to neutralize it. Is there any way to counteract the energy from the amulet? Kali asked, her voice trembling. Something to weaken it before we attempt to destroy it? Possibly, Isolde said, her tone grim. Ancient curses and artifacts often have counter spells or rituals associated with them. If we can find someone knowledgeable about these things, like a local historian or a mystic, we might have a chance. Zephyr glanced at the group, determination in his eyes. All right, we'll head back to town and see if we can find any resources or experts who might help us. We need to figure out how to neutralize this curse once and for all. With a renewed sense of purpose, the group made their way back to the town, taking a different route to avoid drawing the dark figure's attention. The journey back was tense, the oppressive atmosphere of the forest still heavy on their minds. By the time they reached the town, it was early evening. The fading light cast long shadows on the streets, adding to the sense of unease that had settled over them. They made their way to the local library, hoping to find historical records that might shed light on the amulet and its curse. Inside, the library was dimly lit, the old wooden shelves lined with dusty books and manuscripts. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Peterson, looked up from behind the counter as they entered, her eyes widening at the sight of their disheveled appearance. "What happened to you all?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "It's a long story," Zephyr said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need your help. We're looking for any records or information about a dark curse or ancient artifacts related to the Blackwood Forest." Mrs. Peterson's expression shifted from concern to curiosity. "You're not the first to come asking about the forest's dark history. There's been talk of strange occurrences for years. We do have some old records and books that might be relevant." She led them to a back room filled with old, leather-bound volumes and yellowing manuscripts. Orion and Kali immediately set to work, sifting through the documents while Zephyr and Syrah spoke with Mrs. Peterson about any local experts or historians who might be able to provide additional insight. As the hours passed, Orion and Kali uncovered several references to ancient rituals and artifacts associated with the forest. One book contained detailed accounts of the protective words and symbols that had been used to contain dark forces. Another manuscript described a ritualistic method for neutralizing dark energy potentially useful for dealing with the amulet's curse. "This is it," Orion said, holding up a particularly old tome. "It describes a ritual that involves a specific incantation and the use of a cleansing agent, something that can purify and neutralize the dark energy. It might be exactly what we need." Mrs. Peterson, who had been listening intently, nodded. "There's an old woman in town, Mrs. Hawkins, who's known for her knowledge of local lore and ancient practices. She might be able to help you with the ritual and any other details you might need." With their new lead, the group made their way to Mrs. Hawkins' small cottage on the edge of town. The sun had set, and the darkness seemed even more profound now. As if the forest was encroaching on the town itself, Mrs. Hawkins, a frail but sharp-eyed woman, welcomed them into her home, which was filled with herbs, old scrolls, and various mystical artifacts. After hearing their story and examining the amulet, she agreed to help them with the ritual. The amulet is indeed a source of dark power, Mrs. Hawkins said, her voice steady, but with the right ritual, we can neutralize its influence. We'll need to perform the cleansing ritual at a location that's free of the curse's taint, a place where the dark energy hasn't seeped in. Zephyr and the others listened intently as Mrs. Hawkins outlined the ritual's requirements. They would need to gather specific herbs and ingredients, and the ritual would need to be performed under the light of the full moon to be effective. Tonight is the night of the full moon, Mrs. Hawkins added. If we act quickly, we can perform the ritual and rid this town of the lingering curse. The group, now filled with a renewed sense of urgency and hope, prepared for the ritual as they gathered the necessary ingredients and made their way to the designated location, a secluded grove known to be free from dark influences. They felt the weight of their mission pressing upon them. The grove was bathed in the soft, silvery light of the full moon, casting an ethereal glow over the clearing. Mrs. Hawkins began the ritual, chanting ancient incantations and performing intricate gestures. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs, and the energy in the grove felt electric, charged with a powerful cleansing force. As the ritual reached its climax, the amulet's dark energy seemed to dissipate, the oppressive weight lifting from the grove. The dark figure that had pursued them earlier began to waver and fade, its form breaking apart as the cleansing energy took hold. With the ritual complete, the group felt a profound sense of relief. The curse's grip on the town had been broken, and the darkness that had haunted them was finally dissipating. As they made their way back to the town, they knew that their journey was far from over. The experiences they had faced had changed them, forged new bonds, and revealed the strength they never knew they had. And as they looked toward the future, they knew they would face whatever came next with courage and unity. The town was safe, for now, but the forest's shadows still whispered of secrets yet to be uncovered. And though the curse was broken, the story was far from over. The grove where Mrs. Hawkins had performed the ritual was tranquil now, a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. The air, once heavy with dark energy, was now light and soothing, the oppressive chill replaced by a gentle, calming breeze. As the group made their way back to town, they were met with a mix of exhaustion and relief. The ordeal had taken its toll, but the weight of their mission seemed to lift with every step they took. The journey back was quiet, each member of the group lost in their thoughts. The once eerie darkness of the forest now seemed less menacing, though the memory of the dark figure and the cursed amulet still lingered in their minds. They reached the town just as dawn was breaking, the first light of day casting a hopeful glow over the sleepy streets. Mrs. Peterson had stayed up late, anxiously awaiting their return. When she saw them, she rushed over, her face a mix of worry and hope. "Did you manage to break the curse?" she asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. Zephyr nodded, a tired but genuine smile on his face. "Yes, we did. With Mrs. Hawkins' help, we performed the ritual, and the dark energy has been neutralized. The amulet is no longer a threat." Mrs. Peterson's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you. You've saved us all from a terrible fate. I don't know how we could ever repay you." "There's no need for repayment," Zephyr said. "We did it because it was the right thing to do. But if there's anything we can do to help you or the town, just let us know." With the immediate threat dealt with, the group took some time to rest and recuperate. They spent the day reflecting on their experiences, sharing stories, and processing the events that had unfolded. The town was quiet, a sense of normalcy returning as the curse's grip faded away. Syrah and Thad took a walk through the town, their earlier moments of connection now deepened by the shared ordeal. They spoke softly, their conversation punctuated by comfortable silences. The trauma they had faced had brought them closer together, and their budding romance was now a source of strength and comfort. Kali, still shaken but trying to maintain her usual humor, spent time with Orion, who was busy researching the forest's history. "So, now that the curse is broken, what's next on the agenda?" she asked, attempting to lighten the mood. Orion looked up from his notes, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I'm thinking we should delve deeper into the history of the forest. There might be more to uncover about the dark forces we encountered, and it could help us prevent future occurrences." Kali nodded, her gaze drifting toward the distant forest. "I suppose it's time we learned all we can. After all, it's not every day you encounter a cursed amulet and a vengeful spirit." As evening approached, the group gathered in the town's small diner for a meal. The atmosphere was more relaxed, the tension of the past few days giving way to a sense of camaraderie and accomplishment. They laughed and talked, the diner's warm light and comforting food providing a much-needed respite. Mrs. Hawkins joined them for dinner, her presence a reminder of the town's gratitude. "You've done more than you know," she said, her eyes kind. "You've given this town a chance to start anew. We'll never forget what you've done." The group exchanged glances, their earlier exhaustion replaced by a sense of fulfillment. They had faced unimaginable challenges and emerged victorious, their bonds stronger than ever. As they finished their meal and prepared to leave, Mrs. Hawkins pulled Zephyr aside. "There's something you should know," she said quietly. "The forest is still holding secrets. There are other dark forces, ancient and powerful, that have been kept at bay. They may stir again in the future. Be prepared." Zephyr nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "We'll be ready. Thank you for everything." With their spirits lifted and their mission accomplished, the group prepared to leave the town. They knew their journey was far from over, but for now, they could take solace in the fact that they had made a difference. The town was safe, the curse broken, and the bonds of friendship and love that had formed during their ordeal were unbreakable. As they left the town behind and ventured toward the horizon, the forest loomed in the distance, its shadows now less foreboding. They knew that their path was uncertain, but they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they would confront the darkness, uncover the secrets of the forest, and continue their quest for truth and justice. And so, with hearts full of hope and determination, they stepped into the unknown, ready to embrace the adventures that awaited them in the shadows of Blackwood Forest.